one of the biggest firefights we got in when we were in Vietnam wasn't even an op. We had talked my boss into letting us go on a picnic. Commandeered some big T-bone steaks, and of course we had our beer and stuff, and we did some searching out in the South China Sea, and we found these little bitty islands out there that were desolate. That's where we wanted to go have our picnic. Well, not everybody went. I think there was 7 or 8 of us that went. Mr. Marsh didn't go. He had told us that, gave us our rules, not to get totally drunk. We had to take all of our gear with us, and we took the big boat that would hold 14 people. And so we left that morning, and the only way to get out into the South China Sea was going into this big tributary that dumped out into the South China Sea. And it was probably 15, 20 clicks away from base camp. We went through some of the smaller little rivers to get to the big one, and of course, there's Vietnamese all over the place. During the daytime, that's what they do. They fish, they farm the rice. So we were in contact with Vietnamese all the way through. There's Viet Cong there along with them, and here they see this American boat going down through the tributaries, and they know all of South Vietnam, and they know where some of these tributaries that we took, where it took you to. And if they're Viet Cong, they're going to watch what you do, because very seldom do they see us in the daylight. Anyway, along the way, I guess, I don't know really how they communicated, because we didn't have cell phones back then, but I imagine they had their own type of radio system. Well, they let it be known that Americans were going this way, going out towards the South China Sea. And the only way you get back is the same way. So they knew eventually we was going to have to come back. Well, I guess while we was out doing our thing, and we made it to this little bitty island, we searched it out and make sure nobody was on it. And we started having our barbecue and drinking beer and having a pretty good time. It's almost like being at home. Except, we're still in the war zone, and the South China Sea is full of Viet Cong. So, we met a few sampans going out. We don't do anything to them during the daytime, because that's their livelihood. You can search a sampan all you want. During the day, they look like Vietnamese, We didn't pull over sampans during the day to check them out. But anyway, we're on the island, and of course time got away from us, and by the time we realized that we needed to be heading back, it was starting to get dark. And I'm going, man, Mr. Marshall's going to kill us, and because he wanted us back before dark. Of course, we went back the same way, went back up the big river, and we were probably over halfway home to get back to the base camp, but we were on the bigger river, and it was probably about, I don't know, maybe 75 foot wide, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. But anyway, we're in the middle of the river, and we're just putting along. We're not going fast. Well, in Vietnam, when the Viet Cong were going to attack you, there was a warning. It's pitch quiet other than our boat doing this little humming with its. We had 2 twin 47s on it, and we heard a shot in the air. That piqued our interest. We look at each other, and we go a little bit farther. You hear a second shot. Well, when you hear the second shot, something's going to happen. So we were getting ready. I got over there where my M60 was, and I I had it on my rucksack. It's when I had my 1,500 rounds. Everybody else got to their guns, and by the time you hear the third shot, that's when a firefight would start. So we heard that third shot go up in the air. Let it known, the ones that were going to ambush us, that we were in the zone. So first thing we see, B-40 rockets coming at us. And they were coming from both sides of the river. And they went over the boat and went over onto the other side and hit where they were. By the time they hit, we had opened up. Because when they shot those B-40 rockets, we had pop-up flares, which lights up the sky. And it was probably, to me, it looked like they had about 100 yards of Viet Cong along the river. And they were shooting at us with their AK-47s and shooting rockets at us. For some reason, every time they would shoot them rockets, they'd miss the boat. Now, there was probably 8 B-40 rockets shot at us. None of them hit the boat. They were hitting the banks. They were hitting their own people, and I'm over there laying down line of fire with my M60. The other guys are shooting their stoners and their M16s, and they're shooting their 40 Mike grenades out of the bottom of the M16s, and we could see the bodies hitting the water. And I had a friend of mine named Ron Queer. He was on the right-hand side of me, and you could, the water was just getting peppered with AK-47 rounds, but hitting the boat, but none of us were getting hit yet. Well, there was so much fire that was coming from the banks, and he had a stoner, and he had his head down below the bow, and when he was shooting, he was just shooting the water in front of the boat, trying to keep his head down. And I kept hitting him, and I said, Ron, I said, point at the bank. I said, you're hitting all the water in front of the boat. He said, you're not hitting nobody. He'd run out of his ammo, and he'd reload it, and he'd put it back up. And by then, I was close to being empty on my M60. My barrel was hot. In fact, I was starting to, after you shoot so many times through a barrel, and you don't give it a break, it starts glowing red. And you could actually see the rounds going out the barrel. And I knew sooner or later that my gun was going to be shot. Once they go out the barrel and that barrel's hot, it get a little bit of bend to it, they don't go straight. Well, I ran out, and before I run out, Ron was still over there spraying the water in front of us. The guy had the boat on step, and I laid my barrel of my M60 on his arm to snap him out. He was just like he couldn't get out of his mode. And I laid that barrel on, and it burned his arm, and he looked up, and I said, man, the bank, shoot at the bank. Well, I ran out of the M60 rounds, so I got on the guns boats. They had a M60 mounted in the middle of the boat. They just had, and plus we had the mini gun on the back end of the boat, and every now and then the boat guy would take the boat and swing it to where we could take the back of the boat and this minigun shot 4,000 rounds a minute, and we would just rake that bank, and then he'd flip it around and do the other side, and we sort of doing swan dives back and forth through the river. And we finally ran out of ammo. We had a little bit left, and we finally got out of the fire zone. It was pitch dark, and we're not going to make it back to base, because I said we couldn't get in another fight. And none of us never got a nick on us. I don't know how many Viet Cong we killed, but you could just see them falling over into the river. And normally, when we get in a firefight, you do a body count. Well, we weren't doing a body count because we didn't have any ammo to continue. We went about 5 or 6 more clicks up into the river, and we pulled off into a tributary, and that's where we sat for the night, waiting for daylight. And of course, we got back to base. The boss chewed us out left and right. And, we weren't allowed to do any of that again either. He was sort of like a dad. We didn't get vehicles over in Vietnam. We stole our vehicles, and I wrecked every vehicle that I drove over there. And we got a Jeep for him, and of course it was his Jeep. He knew it was stolen. Every now and then I'd ask to use it, and he would give me the riot act. Because I wrecked our state truck. I wrecked the 6x. We had a weapons carrier I wrecked. So he wanted to keep the Jeep so he could have something to go back and forth to Rockjaw, Rock Soy. And it was strange that Navy SEALs didn't get vehicles in Vietnam. They just wanted you to operate out of your base, and that's it. They didn't want you running all over the place. I don't know if I told you we got caught with the vehicles. And that happened about 6 weeks after we had gotten them. They were Army. We painted them gray, put some the military numbers in the Navy start off with a B, and it would have like 6 numbers on it. And we put the numbers on the the hood, and we just drove them like they were. You know, who's going to check a military vehicle, you know? And besides, there weren't that many Americans down where we at. There wasn't nobody looking for stolen vehicles. So we stole them out of Bentooey, which was about a 3-hour drive away. Anyway, we were going to town, me and 3 other guys, and I was driving. They had this curve, and I was doing probably 45, 50 mile an hour, and when we hit this curve, there was a 6x coming the other way, and they had a guy with 3 guys on his Honda 50 trying to make it around that curve to pass up that 6x. The roads over there was no shoulders. Had that little spot that you drove on, and I didn't hit them. They hit the rear of my tire. Of course, when they hit the back of the tire of the Jeep, they fell all over the road, and you know, and I slammed on my brakes, and we was going to stop and get out, but we seen them all getting up because they were only probably doing 30 mile an hour or whatever Honda 50 do with 3 guys on it, and I've seen more than 3 people on a Honda 50 over there. Anyway, we were just passing a Vietnamese outpost. When I stopped and we seen that they were all right, I said, man, let's just go ahead and go into town. Well, when I started to take off, that Vietnamese outpost started shooting. At first, they were just shooting in the air, trying to get us to stay. And I go, man, I said, we're going. They took a couple of pot shots at us, and we were going to shoot back because they were the Vietnamese army. And we went into town, and we was at a bar, and we're all sitting there drinking beer. We'd been there for about an hour or so, and we called them white mice. They were the Vietnamese police, and they dressed in white, but we called them the white mice. Anyway, they came in, and I understood Vietnamese, and they were asking whose Jeep was that outside. I said it's mine. So, and they started talking to me. They was doing some in Vietnamese and then some in American, and they finally understood. And I said, yeah. I said, they hit my Jeep. I said, I didn't hit them. They hit my Jeep. And I said, but we kept on going. And they said, well, we got to arrest you. They're injured. I said, oh, good night. So anyway, we didn't make it back to home that day. So Mr. Marsh the next morning went looking for us. Well, we were in jail. Me and the 3 other guys. I think it was Ron, Tim Stodmeyer, Chuck Holler were the other 3 guys. You know, Chuck Holler just passed away from about 2 months ago from cancer. But anyway, they weren't going to let us go. Mr. Marsh went there, and he tried to talk them, and they go, no. Then we had to see a judge, and we did injury to the Vietnamese and so forth and so on. And we're going to talk to Mr. Marsh, you know. He said, man, I don't want to spend the rest of my time in Vietnamese jail in Vietnam. You know, we had a commander that was over our section of Vietnam. He got wind of it. Of course, he came and he was talking to the Vietnamese police officer that ran that police station. And what was strange, we could have broke out of that jail anytime we wanted. It was ridiculously built, just cheap iron bars that we could have pulled them up out of the ground, you know. We was already in enough trouble. And anyway, this commander came down and he started talking to us, and when he goes, whose Jeep is that? I look at him like, oh man. I said, we go, it's ours. He said, no. I said, he goes, whose Jeep is that? He said, look, he said, I run this section of Vietnam. He said, you SEALs don't have vehicles. He goes, well, whose Jeep is it? And so I go, well, it was a 2-star general's Jeep out of Bentooey. And he looked at us and he goes, what else do you got? We go, what do you mean? He said, is that the only vehicle you have? He said, I'm going to check your base. And so we got some, well, no, we got a weapons carrier, and we got a state truck, and a 6x, and the Jeep. And I said, we painted them gray, so they look like on the Navy. And he just shook his head, and he said, well, you know what? He said, they had to give money to these Vietnamese, drop the charges, even though we didn't hit them, you know. But he said, you know, he said, we're going to let you keep them vehicles. He said, but if you get caught, he said, you're going to go down stealing military vehicles. He was a cool guy. Anyway, after that, I didn't drive a whole lot more after that. I would keep for some reason I was a good mechanic, and I grew up building car engines and so forth, and so I kept the vehicles running except for the ones that were too wrecked to drive anymore. You know, Vietnam was a strange place, you know. I never really had any fear of going anywhere in Vietnam. I knew places that I shouldn't go, but it was a bunch of the guys were the same way. It was just in our natures. We'd go places that were off limits to Americans. Well, that's where we wanted to go, you know. And sometimes we got in trouble, and most times we did fine. But that firefight, I never got off the M60s. I liked firefights and don't know why. The way they made the adrenaline run in you, I just enjoyed being in firefights. I didn't tell my mother I went to Vietnam, or my father. They really didn't know anything about SEAL team. I just told them it was a special unit in the Navy. Well, they thought I'd be on a ship somewhere and be safe. So when I went to Vietnam, and my mother had already went through a year of my brother Tom being in Vietnam, and he came back a total wreck. Never got over the war. She didn't want none of us to go over there. My brother Bob was over there at the same time I was over there. I never wanted to go see him. I told him, don't come and see me. My mother was hounding SEAL team in Coronado, because I always talked to my mother. I talked to her about once a week. Ain't no way to talk to anybody in Vietnam. They didn't have payphones. Besides, I didn't tell her I was there. And I'd already been there about 3 months, and my mother was constantly contacting SEAL team, wanting to know where I was at. They don't tell people where we're at. But word got to my Lieutenant Marsh that my mother was looking for me, wanting to know why I hadn't been calling and so forth. And Mr. Marsh was all over my case. He said, you need to write your mother a letter. And I looked at him and I said, I ain't wrote a letter in my life. I said, what am I supposed to write to my mother? And I'm in Vietnam. And he said, you just write your mother a letter. And he said, that's an order. He said, you need to tell your mother where you're at and that you're okay and all that kind of stuff. You know, what mothers want to hear. And of course, I didn't write her that. I wrote her about firefights, telling her how much I liked them and that I was doing great. And I said, you know, I only wrote her that one letter the whole time I was over there. I wasn't much for writing any letters, but I wish I could find that letter. My mom has passed away since then. I figured she would have kept it, but I just never come across it after she passed away 50 years ago, so ain't no telling. Last operation we did in Vietnam, it was right before Christmas, and my lieutenant wanted to go out and check sampans. And now he was just recently, his wife was pregnant when we went over, and they had the baby while he was on Vietnam. And we had Vietnam on January the 10th or the 11th, so this was about a week before Christmas, and he wanted to do an op. When you come up with an operation, we had the right to say no. Too risky. Well, this operation that he wanted to do, he wanted to check sampans in the South China Sea. And we're going at night. And we go, well, he said, the only ones that are out at night are the Viet Cong. And we go, we're not made for sampans, not Americans anyway. And South China Sea is not no smooth, and, you know, it's choppy and so forth. And we're going, carrying our gear and being in, you know, because we did a lot of ops in the rivers and canals, which was bad enough. But I said, you know, that doesn't sound like a good thing to do, you know. We've got three and a half weeks left to go. I said, it doesn't sound like a good op, you know. The intel, there's no intel. I said, you're going to find the Viet Cong sooner or later if you pull over enough sampans. But we go, no. So we all said no. And the only one that said yes was P.K. Barnes. And he was a new guy. He replaced one of our guys that went back home out of our platoon. And he'd only been there for, I don't know, month and a half or so. He came out and came from the States to replace one of our guys. We always tried to keep 14 in the platoon. So he was green. He said, I'll go. It was Mr. Marsh and PK and 4 of our LDNs went in the sampan to check for Viet Cong in the South China Sea. Well, we were back at the base listening on the radio. If anything came about, we were in contact with our big boat, because the big boat followed them out. And if anything happened, the big boat will go out there and get them. And I think the first sampan that they light aid, they were coming at the sampan, they were coming at straight on, and the sampan was doing the same way. Well, before Mr. Marsh's sampan got to him, the other sampan turned sideways. Well, when it turned sideways, and Mr. Marsh was close enough, they could see that they had AK-47s. So Mr. Marsh, and for I don't know why, we had a .45 burp gun from World War II. And that's what he picked up to shoot at the Viet Cong. It jammed on the first round. If Mr. Marsh would have, there was, I think there was 3 Viet Cong in the sampan. If Mr. Marsh would have opened up, he probably would have got them all. But lost that first second of a firefight. When it jammed, the Viet Cong opened up. Mr. Marsh got hit first because he got hit right across his forehead, and then he got hit down in the back where he got hit in the spine because he was paralyzed for life. He didn't die, and but the other LD&Ns stood up, and everybody that stood up got hit. Two of them got hit in the head, and the other one got hit here, and they were killed instantly. The only Mr. Long and PK didn't stand up. Well, PK opened up with that stoner, had a 50-round drum on it, wiped him out. And the bad thing about it, when PK went to put the stoner down, his hand was still on the trigger, and he blew a hole in the sampan. Well, the sampan started sinking. Well, PK went into the water because everybody that got hit fell out of the boat. PK went in the water to grab Mr. Marsh. He was still alive. He grabbed the other ones. Mr. Long was helped. Mr. Long got shot. He got shot in the leg. And they sort of tried to tie them all together. And in the meantime, when the boat sank, all the pop-up flares and everything went down. And luckily, the part of the South China Sea they were in, it was only about 5 foot of water. So PPA would go down and search for stuff in the boat because he was looking for the pop-up flares, because when you do a pop-up flare, the big boat guys knew something. Of course, they knew something was wrong because they were close enough to hear the shooting, but they didn't know exactly where they were at. So we finally got some pop-up flares and popped them, gave their position, and the boat, came in. And at the same time, we was hearing all this when they got in the firefight. The boat was trying to communicate with Mr. Marsh, so we was hearing it on the radio. And at that time, we called Ben Toohey for support for helivacing, and of course they were all hit. And the big boat had made it to PK's, and they had got them all out of the water. They laid 3 LD&Ns on the back of the boat, and one of these LD&Ns, I was just super good friends with him. He had just gotten married. He was a chief in the Vietnamese Navy. He was assigned to us to help us go on ops and so forth. We went to his wedding. I think he'd been married for about 3 weeks. He was in his 30s, great guy. And but he got hit in the head. The boat brought everybody back besides PK and Mr. Morris. He got on the helicopter and went up, flew to Ben Toohey with Mr. Marsh. The boat came in, and Long was on the boat, and the other 3 LD&Ns, and we went down there and picked them up. And of course we didn't have any place to really put them. We had a little shop next to our Quonset hut, and that we wouldn't put them in there until the Vietnamese would come and get them and so forth. But we wanted revenge, so we made up. This was after Christmas. We had another op before we left, and we knew where Viet Cong hamlet was, and it was 90% Viet Cong. We made an op to go take out that hamlet, and we did. And it was our last op that we did in Vietnam, was a revenge op. And after that, we had about another week or so to go, and the same plane that flew us to Vietnam, that's what picked us up in Saigon Airport, Tan Son Nhut Airport. And I didn't want to get back on that plane. And the same thing in the meantime, Clint's platoon, X-Ray, was getting annihilated. Every op they'd go on, they would get wounded, or 1 or 2 would get killed. And the next op they would go on, wherever they went, the Viet Cong were waiting for them. And they were looking for replacements. And me and Tim Stodmeyer and PK went because you had to do your whole tour. Even if your platoon was going back home and you didn't do your whole tour, they would send you over to another platoon in Vietnam. Well, he volunteered to go to X-Ray platoon, and me and Tim Stodmeyer, Tim was one of my best friends. He carried the M16 in his squad, and I carried mine, and we wanted to go, but we tried to go, and commanding colonel said no. He said, you got to come home before you can ever go back. He said, you got to be home for 30 days, and then you can volunteer to go back. By the time we got home, and before that 30 days was up, the Clint's platoon was decommissioned, because there was just Clint and one other guy left. They weren't going to send any more replacements. They didn't get to do their full tour, because They decommissioned it because they were all wounded or dead, and plus the ones that would, PK lost his leg over there in Clint's platoon right towards the end. In fact, I think that was the last op that Clint went on. And Happy Baker started off in my platoon in Vietnam, but he got dysentery so bad he was a toothpick, and so they couldn't get rid of the dysentery, and they sent him home. And when he got better, well, they sent him back to Vietnam, and he was in Clint's platoon. That ended my tour in Vietnam. So when I got back to the States, I went to some advanced cadre schools where they teach you more about espionage. Because we would do stuff that I wasn't in the military. I was just in regular civilian clothes, but they taught us how to track people and trail them and not be seen. And it was pretty unique. I liked it. And they had a civilian scientists were wanting to have guinea pigs to see how long you can live in cold water. They couldn't find enough civilians that would, because they would tell you what the conditions were going to be. They had a place out in China Lake, California, that they had put this swimming pool off of the military base there and put a big metal building over it, and they would try to give it the Arctic temperatures. Water was somewhere between 34, 36 degrees, and they wanted to know how long you could live in that water without losing all your body functions. When we first started doing it, they did it, in 70-degree water. And even 70-degree water, you stay in it long enough, your thermal temperature is going to drop. And once you get down to a certain temperature, the core of your body, you pass out and then you drown. Well, then we do it in 50-degree water, and then we finally got down into 40s. And when it got down into, even in the 40s, if you just jump in that water at 40 degrees, in about 5-6 minutes, you don't have no function. Not necessarily that you're drowning yet, but you don't have the control of your arms or your legs, because cold water does weird stuff to the body. And it's like you really couldn't swim, because your arms, you might swim, but it was a choppy, sloppy swim, and you're not going to go very far. And so they knew that, some of us could last 5 minutes, some of us last 7-8 minutes, but after that, and then when we got down into the 30s, you last about 3 or 4 minutes and you start losing your body function. So then they said, well, now we're going to test you in wetsuits. We did testing in wetsuits. Well, in the wetsuit, we had a 2-man sub, we call them SDVs. We had them in the SEAL team. They're a 2-man sub, and you breathe on oxygen with scuba tanks. You got like 10 scuba tanks on it, so you could stay down a long time. Well, they would take and lower the SDV down in the water, and it was hooked up to a computer. We swallowed these pills that radio transmitters that gave all our core temperatures and our heart rate and all that kind of stuff, and so they can log it all. Well, we'd be in that water for 3 hours, and then they would crank the SDV up, had these fans blowing, and the deal was that we were going to set explosives, simulate setting explosives on a radar tower in Antarctica. And so they make us get on a bicycle, and they had these fans blowing on you, and that's when you got cold. You thought that water was cold, and that wind blowing on you, and your wetsuit's wet, and your body temperature starts really dropping. But they had us ride these bicycles like we climbed a mountain, and then we got to the radar station. They would have fake explosives for us to see if we can put the explosives on the radar station, wire it up, set the timers with your hands just frozen, and then get back on the bike, because you're out of the water for about an hour, and ride the bike back down to where your sub was, which was supposed to be in the ocean. Get back in the sub for 3 hours to go back to the mothership. Well, we proved to them that it could be done, and we also proved that sometimes you died, because when our core temperatures dropped down to, I think, 89 was where you passed out, and a lot of us went to 89. I don't know why. Sometimes we made it and sometimes we didn't. But when your core temperature dropped like that, they would jerk you out of the water, and they throw you in a hot water tub, and you thought it was boiling. Man, that water was hot, but it wasn't hot. I think it was 104 degrees or 110 degrees, something like that. Plus you still had your wetsuit on, but it heated up your core temperature, and it would wreak havoc on you. I mean, you thought you hadn't went to bed for 3 weeks after that 6 or 7 hours of doing that, and they let you recuperate for 3 or 4 days. We did it for a little over 5 months, and but every third or fourth day you're back in the water. And there was 14 of us doing it, so we were all taking turns. But about every fourth day, sometimes fifth day, it'd be your turn to go back. It was sort of like going through Hell Week over and over again. You go, because you knew what it was going to be like, but they needed more data because they wanted to know why sometimes you lived and sometimes you didn't. But it was unique. I've never been the same. I don't get cold. Me and my wife, we've been together going to be 50 years next year, and she's hot-natured and I'm cold-natured. I like it 50 degrees and she likes it 90 degrees, but you know, she understands it. It's just the way I am. I don't wear coats. I ride my motorcycle in the wintertime with no coat on. I just don't get cold. I think they messed up my thermostat, but we're jump qualified when you're a Navy SEAL. You're diving qualified, jump qualified. You always got to do diving to keep qualified. You always got to jump to stay qualified. And plus, they paid you more money. Well, when you're in Vietnam, you don't jump out of nothing in Vietnam. Normally, you jump every month, and so I didn't jump the whole time I was in Vietnam. And when I first got back, we was off for a month. They gave us 30 days to do whatever you want, go home and so forth. And I spent one of my weeks, I flew home and bought my first car up in Ohio and drove it back to California. So I hadn't probably jumped in about 10, 11 months, and they said, you know, hey, there's a bunch of you guys, you need to qualify again for your jumps, or we're going to quit giving you jump pay. Well, I like jumping out of airplanes. If you ain't never done it, you need to try it. As long as your chute's open, it's all good. Anyway, I think there was 29 of us on a Chinook. It's one of the ones where they open up the back door and you just walk off, and we were going up 5,000 feet, and we were all going to do our jump, and we was all lined up waiting for the jump master to tell us to walk off the back of the plane, and we felt the helicopter do a little bit of a shake, which, you know, it's like an airplane. You hit turbulence on a helicopter, it does the same thing, you know. But the red light popped up right at the end of the Chinook before you go out the door. And that red light popped up, and the jump master looked at that and he goes, back to the seats, sit down, strap in. So before we got back to the seat, it was like, you felt like you was a little bit lighter because the helicopter was falling. And we get back and then realize that the helicopter is falling. And we're looking at each other, and in my mind, I'm going, man, I made it all through Vietnam, not a scratch on me. And I said, I'm going to die in a helicopter crash back in the States. I said, what a way to go. We could feel the helicopter was falling, and then somehow or another the helicopter pilot got it to auto-rotate back. And what it was, the helicopter had lost its hydraulic, the transmission fluid or the hydraulic, the blades quit working. But somehow or another he got to auto-rotate while we were going down, and it slowed us down. Instead of splatting at 200 miles an hour, they estimate that we hit the ground, and it was soft ground because we always jumped in these fields that were plowed. You know, the dirt was 2-3 foot deep. We probably hit it doing 35, 40 mile an hour. When it hit, it was just a gigantic slam down, and the struts came up through the floor, and you know, we're still just looking at it like, you know, whenever you hear about plane crashes, helicopter crashes, they explode. Well, the engines weren't running. It didn't catch on fire, and it didn't explode. The back door was still open, even though it was crunched up some, we can still get out. So after it hit, that jump master said, out, you know, man, we was out of there in 20, I think less than 10 seconds, we was all out of that plane. Of course, we still had our chutes on, and it was about 15 minutes later, ambulances came by. They had us sitting down on the ground. Ambulances came by, and the corpsmen's come out, and they're coming by checking each one of us. And of course, you know, our adrenaline was so high, I probably wouldn't have felt nothing. I didn't feel nothing. I said, oh, man, I feel good. I'm fine. Everybody else was saying the same thing. The helicopter pilots, they weren't hurt. Nobody was hurt. We were looking at the helicopter. When it hit, the blades snapped off because, you know, those Hueys, those blades run out there 30 feet, and when they're not spinning, they hang low. Well, when we hit, those blades hit and it snapped them off, and I don't know how nobody got a scratch on them. I think God was always looking out for us for some reason. There's stuff we'd go through that you weren't even supposed to live. About 45 minutes after the crash, we see another Chinook in the air coming towards us. And then he lands, and the jump master says, because we were all still sitting on the ground, you know, just having chit chat, you know, waiting for them to do whatever. We thought they was going to bring a bus and take us back. And that Chinook landed, and that jump master looked at us and said, everybody on the helicopter. We looked at him, do what? He said, get on the helicopter. We're going back up to do the jump. Y'all are okay? Yeah. Well, he said, if you don't get on that helicopter today, he said, you'll never get on one. He said, you'll be too afraid. He said, but we're going to go do a jump. And we all look at each other and we go, what's the chance of a helicopter crashing twice in the same day? You know, so, and it was a beautiful jump. I liked it. After that, I did some more training. They were always training. We still play war games. But Vietnam was winding down because I got back in 71, and for my next 2 years I was just going to different schools, learning different trades and guerrilla warfare and so forth. And I was going to re-up for 2 more years. They were going to give $8,000, and I was a E5 when I got out, and I was going to E6 rank plus $8,000 for 2 more years, and I was going to get to go to Halo school, and they were going to send me off to ski school. And I mean, you learn to do everything if you were in SEAL team. It's because you were supposed to be able to go anywhere. But desert fighting, I don't know about desert fighting. There ain't no place to hide. They trained SEALs to be able to go anywhere, any type of terrain. You would go to learn how to fight in Alaska. It looked like a snow bunny. But all in all, you know, I did 4 years to the day. And I wouldn't trade that for nothing. You know, I got some body issues now that should have probably been taken care of 30, 40 years ago. And it's showing up now. The older I get, the worse my bones are. And I tell you, military is a good way to find out who you are. Maybe one of these days I'll talk about some other stuff, but for that, that's it.
Dave Perry. Like I said, I knew Dave when I first checked in at training. We remained friends. He went over to Vietnam about 3 months before I did, and then I followed with my platoon. And once we got back stateside, we became massive friends and roommates and partners for life as he married to my first cousin now. And like I told Donnie earlier, Dave's one of them type of people that he wasn't carrying a gun, and I had a shotgun, I still wouldn't fight him. He got in a fight one night in a little basically all-night diner we went into, and he needed to go to the bathroom, and these bikers were in the way, and they told him to walk around. He said no. They told him to step over their legs. He said no. They told him to crawl under their legs. He said no. About this time, I started to get up off of my stool, and Dave told me to sit down, so I did. And I watched what went on. He threw a couple of them out the plate glass window, broke legs and arms on the others. They filed charges in the civilian court of Coronado. We had to put on navy blues and show up for court, and I was there as a witness. They read the charges off against Dave, and there's about 5 thugs sitting over there with cast on and black eyes and broken legs and broken arms, and judge is listening to the guy read off the charges against Dave, and judge looks at him, he says, that sounds like a case of self-defense to me, and dismissed the case. I got mad at Dave because I had to get dressed up just to go to court.